So I'm Sarah Savitt, publisher of Virago, and I'm really delighted to be here today with Sonia. I'm very proud to be her editor. Sonia is a biographer and journalist who's written for The Guardian, The Daily Telegraph, and The Sunday Times. Her book, First Lady, The Life and Wars of Clementine Churchill, was Book of the Year in The Telegraph, Independent, and Lenny Letter, and was shortlisted for the Plutarch Award for Best Biography. Her first book, Just Boris, A Tale of Blonde Ambition, my favourite subtitle ever, I think, was longlisted for the Orwell Prize. But Sonia's here to talk about her new book, A Woman of No Importance, the untold story of World War II's most dangerous spy, Virginia Hall. And that came out in March, and it's been a huge hit on both sides of the Atlantic. So it's on the New York Times bestseller list at the moment, and it's just been stacking up the most incredible set of reviews. So congratulations, Sonia. And yeah, thank you so much for having us here. We're going to talk for sort of 30, 40 minutes and then open it up to audience questions. We've heard you ask really great questions, so please ask them at the end. So Sonia, first, can you tell us who was Virginia Hall and why did you want to write a book about her?
Well, I stumbled across her. I was quite interested in spying and spies generally, and I was reading a little bit about intelligence during the Second World War, and there'd be a whole lot of stuff about all sorts of different people, and every now and again there'd be just a little mention of, oh, there was this American woman who had a wooden leg and spied for the Brits and did amazing things, and it'd be full stop, new paragraph, and nothing more would be said. And I thought, well, she sounds rather intriguing. Why does no one ever sort of write about her? And I started digging into her life, and I couldn't have imagined how extraordinary her life was, how she triumphed over adversity, her resilience, her courage, her determination, but also her secrecy. I mean, she wanted to be a secret agent all her life, and so she wasn't going to make it easy for me, I can tell you, to find out about her life. But I got a few lucky breaks, including having the help of a couple of retired intelligence officers and getting some documents declassified. I spent a day at Langley, the CIA headquarters in America. I found an amazing sort of treasure trove of letters and reminiscences in France. So gradually I pieced together this story of this woman who I feel is unbelievably modern. I mean, there's so much in her story that resonates today. And of course, yeah, she was fighting in the war in the 1940s, but the way that she reacted, the way that she kept going, the way that she pushed down barriers kind of really spoke to me. I mean, I found her really inspirational, and a lot of my friends and I now say, if we're in a sort of tight spot or having a difficult time, well, what would Virginia do? And in fact, even Sarah and I were talking earlier about something, or what would Virginia say? And she had a courage that I simply can't quantify. It really was incredible. Of course she had fears, everyone does, but she managed to conquer them in these amazing ways. So once I started digging into her life, it became almost as an obsession. I spent 3 years, lots of late nights, early mornings, tracking her down, piecing together the story in different ways. And I'm really glad I did. I think she's amazing. The Gestapo didn't think she was amazing, they just thought she was dangerous. They named her the most dangerous of all Allied spies. Quite a competitive field there, but it is incredible, actually, that we didn't really know much about her until now, but I aim to change that.
And as you touched on, she was quite an unlikely spy, as well as a very successful and dangerous one. So you write in the book that she grew up in quite a well-to-do American family, but she ended up spying for the British. She had a prosthetic leg, which must have made it more difficult. But she really did, her mum wanted her to marry the right guy and settle down, have a family. Why did she ditch that life that she was meant to have? Like, what drove her to have this incredible life?
Yeah, well, she grew up in quite a well-to-do family, as you say, just outside Baltimore. Her mother wanted her to settle down and marry, but she always had these very different ideas. She was a tomboy. She loved to go out bareback riding on horses, to go hunting with her dad in the woods. She went into school once with this unusual bracelet made up of live snakes. She was a free spirit, an adventurous soul, and she wanted a career as an ambassador to tour the world and meet what she called interesting people. There was a problem with that, though, which was that at the time, we're talking sort of 1920, she was born in 1906, women did not become ambassadors. There were no women ambassadors in America, I don't think here either. She applied to the State Department, but they turned her down as a diplomat, even though she spoke 5 languages by this point. So she went and worked as a desk clerk at the State Department, and that's when she went to Turkey. She was posted to Turkey, and she gathered some friends. She was always kind of a leader. She was always a leader at school. Gathered some friends, went out on a hunting party one December in Turkey in the marshes there with the gun that actually her father had given her, a hunting gun, and she wanted to shoot snipe. Now, I mean, hunting is not my thing, but apparently snipe have a very erratic pattern of flight. They're quite difficult to hit, and she was always very competitive, and so maybe she wasn't looking where she was going, we don't know, but she tripped over a wire fence that was going through the reeds, and as she tripped, she grabbed her gun, she reached for her gun, and she hadn't applied the safety catch, and so she literally shot herself in the foot at point-blank range. Well, initially I thought she was going to be okay. She was taken to hospital, I thought she was fine, but actually within a week or two, she got gangrene in her left leg. Well, they didn't have antibiotics then, as I'm sure you know. She was on the point of death. There was no other way of saving her, apart from cutting off her leg just below the knee. Even then, I can tell you, it was an absolute miracle she pulled through. So you had this adventurous soul, this tomboy, this free spirit, all these great ambitions, wanting to travel and meet people, and suddenly she thought, going to be reduced to a sort of sedentary life at best. But do you know what? And I know this almost sounds perverse. There was something about that accident that made her the great person that she became, gave her that self-reliance and self-dependence and sheer grit that made her an absolutely brilliant secret agent. So although she might seem to be an unlikely commando leader, and in fact only 2 weeks ago the US Commando Command, so that's rather a mouthful, placed her for the first time on their Hall of Honour. I mean, it took them 40 years since she died, but they got there in the end. She did become the most amazing guerrilla leader. But I think you can draw, and I certainly became convinced of this once I sort of started investigating her life, you can draw a line from that awful, awful accident, which she barely survived, to this amazing leader with charisma and resolve and courage that is actually almost, difficult to imagine.
And you, as you say, she was a really successful spy, and part of that is keeping secrets and not keeping a diary or writing long letters home to her mum about what she was doing.
Yeah.
So how did you touched on this a little bit, but what were the challenges in doing the research? Like how do you write a life of someone whose whole aim is to keep secrets?
Yeah, well, I feel like Virginia and I did play a little bit of cat and mouse while I was writing this, and that, yeah, obviously secret agents unfortunately don't sit down at night and write journals about what they did that day, nor do they do selfies or any of these other useful things. But I was lucky in the sense that she obviously had to file situation reports, sit reps as they call them, back to her controllers. That gave me some idea. A lot of other people wrote about her after the war, but no one had realised that it was all the same person. She had more than 20 different code names. So when people wrote about the time that they met her or things that they knew that she did, they might call her Germaine or Camille or Philomène or Marie or even Nicolas. And it was a question of realising that all those different women who'd done all those different incredible things, they were all the same person. And no one had been mad enough to sit down before and kind of with an organogram, bits of string and post-its and all the rest of it, realise that, yes, she was there and she was doing that kind of thing. So, yes, and, not that many spies had wooden legs either. That did obviously help. That eventually I was able to pull this all together. And then the other thing that happened was that this guy who she fought alongside in southern France in the Haute-Loire was quite obsessed with her after the war. I mean, he'd actually been quite difficult at times, but I think he felt great remorse because she helped to liberate a whole swathe of France without a single professional soldier. And I think he realised that all the things that she'd done had made that possible. And so he spent about 20 years of his life after the war when people were still alive, when a lot of the documents that have now been destroyed, by the way, were still around, and he took copies. And I managed to find this little personal archive that he'd put together in France. And so that was very, very fortunate. I was able to join some of the dots. And then her niece is still alive and lives in Baltimore. She's 89, wonderful woman, sharp as a pin, and some of the stuff she too was able to help me with. And ultimately also the CIA, funny enough, were very helpful, and two former intelligence officers who were able to help me get some files declassified, because a lot of files about the Second World War, particularly intelligence war, are still closed and will be till at least the 2030s. I mean, we think we know everything we need to know about the Second World War. I can assure you there's still a whole lot more out there. Some of it we'll never know because an awful lot of things seem to have been mislaid. We do know that something like 85% of the documents on the British Secret Service she worked for, the SOE, Special Operations Executive, have been destroyed or whatever. They've just disappeared. So it's always going to be a little bit difficult. But, with a bit of elbow grease, you can put these stories together.
Wow. I hadn't quite realised that so many things were missing now. So, I mean, the book is so rich and tells, lots of great stories about what Virginia did. But what were, just to give a flavour to the people in the audience, what were some of her greatest accomplishments, do you think, as a spy and as a commando, as a guerrilla leader?
Well, when she went in 1941, so she went in as an American spying for the Brits. Remember that America wasn't in the war at this point. Pearl Harbor hadn't happened. She didn't have to do any of this stuff. She volunteered. She went into enemy-controlled France when Britain had no spies there. They'd all disappeared after Dunkirk. They'd either died or given up or left. And so Britain expected to be invaded at any point and absolutely knew nothing about what was going on in its closest neighbour. But funny enough, they couldn't find that many people prepared to go in and without any backup. But Virginia would, and so she went in, and that time we all heard about the French resistance. It didn't exist. It didn't just spring up from nowhere, because people were terrified. If you think that a first world power, like a country as important as Britain is today, say, had become a subject nation within 6 weeks, and this had caused such a shock to most French people that they simply could not cope with the idea of fighting back. It took a long time for this idea to be planted. So Virginia went in. Her job was to fan the flames of French resistance, to help make that first sort of little bit of French resistance happen. But anyone she spoke to could be a collaborator. We know there were lots and lots of collaborators. Could be a Nazi stooge. She could be killed at any moment. She had to go up to you, and work out, what side were you on? Would you perhaps help? What could you do? Could you print some false papers? Could you provide a safe house? Would you prepare to hide guns or explosives? What would you prepare to do? And ironically, she had success with some of the most unlikely people, including nuns in a convent who gave her her first safe house and who did brilliantly, and prostitutes in a brothel whose madam became her chief lieutenant and one of the bravest women you can possibly imagine, basically sacrificed herself, her freedom to the Gestapo to save agents. She literally just said, okay, take me, to allow other people to get away, and got all her prostitutes spying on German clients, because they had many German clients. German officers were encouraged to go to brothels. It was thought to make them better fighters. And the prostitutes spied on them, rifled their uniforms, spiked their drinks, they'd fell asleep, and then deliberately infected them. This was kind of like a biological warfare, if you like. And Virginia got the intelligence from them, set them up into these networks, recruited the local police chief. And as the secret documents say, she saved, this is a direct quote, Allied intelligence in France from extinction. Not bad for a disabled woman with virtually no training, because no one knew how to do this stuff. No one had done it before. She pioneered it. She pioneered techniques that the CIA tell me they still use today. I mean, this is how pioneering she was, but no one knew about it. Later, when she went back, the Gestapo knew all about her by this point. They'd sent out this command that we must find and destroy her, that she was the most dangerous Allied spy. She went in disguised as a milkmaid with wrinkles that Hollywood makeup artists had shown her how to put on her face, so realistic and authentic that German officers would come up and think she was in her 60s, she was in her 30s. And eventually formed little ragbag armies of schoolboys and vets and booksellers and teachers and things, and blowing up bridges, ambushing German convoys, and liberating a whole part of France. Now, this was apparently done, another quote from the secret documents, the good humour of a Sunday school picnic. So, you know, she was a pretty amazing woman. They had it was a very conservative time. You know, Vichy France, women were expected to stay at home and have at least 4 kids. And she was there, a foreign woman, somehow persuading hundreds of men to take her orders. They didn't know who she was or where she came from. She persuaded them to do this, to trust her at a time when really you couldn't trust anything. So just to give you a little kind of clue as to why she was actually a woman who was very important indeed, that just gives you a little bit of a flavour.
So you were saying, you know, she innovated and pioneered all these techniques. Was there any training available to her before? Was she just sort of plunged in? Like, what was she sent? What tools was she sent with?
Well, very few. She did get a little bit of training. I mean, one of the things she was taught they got in a burglar to teach her how to pick locks. She was taught how to replace dust on a surface when you remove something. She was taught that urine is a brilliant secret ink because it comes out well under heat. You can see things quite clearly. And she was also shown how to microfilm documents. I mean, obviously, you couldn't send things in the way that you guys can now, but you could shrink documents to tiny little size, like there's like a postage stamp. And she was very fortunate. She had a particularly good hiding place for such documents, which was a tiny little slot in her left in her metal heel, so she was able to put secret documents in there. She was also taught, perhaps most importantly, because she did have a license to kill. It was one of the few things she had in common with James Bond. She didn't drive around in a flashy Aston Martin. I mean, it was absurd. She got the tram or walked like everyone else. She did have a license to kill, and she was shown how to do it, and her preferred method was with poison pills, cyanide pills. Now, these were in unsoluble rubber balls. If you swallowed them whole, you'd be fine. If you broke them and put the contents in someone's food, they wouldn't be fine. They'd die within 45 seconds. If you could hold the pill in your mouth at the back, say, you know, you were worried that you are going to be tortured, you might not be able to hold out. If that was the case, you could then bite into the pill and you would die within 45 seconds. So, but this was pretty much the only training she had, because they didn't know how to set up networks in a hostile country. No one had ever done it before. She had to work it out on the job. So when she set off, they gave her a 50-50 chance of survival, and that was, you know, actually being quite optimistic. So the fact that she did survive longer than almost anyone else in the field is kind of testament to the way that she did become a terrific spy, and her spy craft, her field craft, was great.
You talk in the book about how not only are these, you know, cyanide pills and poison pills, but also there's quite a lot of drugs around as well to help her keep going. Can you say a bit about that?
Okay, so she had 2 other sets of pills. One set would give you the symptoms of typhoid, so that you would be taken to hospital. Supposing you were captured, this was one potential way that you might be able to escape. Hospitals were seen as a softer touch. The other pills, they're most popular pills of all, and you know, these were used in vast quantities, let me tell you, were Benzedrine. They were amphetamines. Because the thing was that in the field, sleep was a luxury, and sometimes you might have to be awake 6 nights on the trot. Well, there's no way you can be sort of dozing off if you're on an operation. So you would pop these things. They were blue, little tiny blue tablets, like sweeties almost, to keep you going. Now, she took lots, I can tell you, and sometimes when she finally needed to sleep, she had to take a downer because they kind of make you so wired, as you can imagine, after all that time. And, I can also tell you that having taken all those pills during the war, and she wasn't the only one, and once she started organising parachute drops, whole bags of these things would come down with the guns and the explosives, and I'm glad to say chocolate too. They realised that chocolate was very important. Almost as important as the Benadryl. But this did have an effect on her heart after the war, and a lot of those agents, their health was clearly affected. And also, there was nothing to eat in France at that time. The Germans were taking pretty much all the food, so she was half-starved as well. Lost a huge amount of weight, and there were people going to hospital in cities like Lyon from the symptoms of famine. I don't think people realised just how tough life was. There was also no soap, so you couldn't get clean. You couldn't wash your clothes and you couldn't wash your sheets or yourself. So life was pretty grim. So the very fact that she, volunteered to do this for a few quid a month, when everyone thought she'd had 50-50 chance of survival, just shows you how determined she was, really.
Absolutely. And you touched upon earlier, this kind of incredible feat, for the time it was anyway for a woman, but also in Vichy France, somewhere it was, very conservative, that she as a woman was able to lead all of these men and sort of persuade them to do all these new things. What were the sort of disadvantages, but also maybe the advantages for her of being a woman in this position?
Well, I think initially it was an advantage in the sense that the Germans in Vichy France, their kind of reactionary views persuaded them, but women didn't get involved in nasty, dirty things like the resistance or parachute drops of guns or blowing up things. And so it was assumed that they would be innocent. But then they kind of worked that out quite quickly, that women were actually hugely involved. And the thing was that they saved some of their absolute worst forms of torture for women. We know that now, that some of the most depraved things, I won't go into the details, were done to women to get secrets out of them, because they realised that often the women knew an awful lot because they were couriers. They would be carrying messages in their heads from one town to another, from one resistance leader to another, and they often knew an awful lot. And so if you think that they were treated any more leniently than men, you'd be wrong. Absolutely the reverse. And it wasn't long that before she became so successful in rescuing other agents from prison, rescuing aircrew that been shot down, people on the run from the Gestapo, small-scale sabotage at this point, that the Germans and Vichy France, the French police, were after her, and they knew now at this point that she had a false leg. They called her the Limping Lady. And you may have heard of Klaus Barbie, the butcher of Lyon, this Gestapo monster, killed thousands of people, was particularly obsessed with her and said that he would give anything to get his hands on her. So she had the whole of the Reich after her, as well as the French police, and at one point had to escape, there was no other way for it, over the Pyrenees in the worst winter for 200 years with Cuthbert, her wooden leg. And the amazing thing is that she made it, and her niece says that was the worst moment for her personally in the war, but she managed to get away. So she always eluded them, amazingly. But many women didn't. Many women, a lot of those prostitutes I told you about, who deliberately infected German officers so that they couldn't fight, who got all that information, passed it on to Virginia. She called them my tart friends. We won't even know their names ever, but a lot of them were caught, tortured and shot, or worse, So there are many, many, many heroes who we will never know about, and who, we owe a great deal to.
You mentioned earlier about that some of the things that she pioneered in terms of spying are still used by the CIA, and I wondered if you could talk, if you're allowed to tell us, what some of those techniques are. But also, the book is really interesting about how Britain and America viewed spying at the time and the sort of differences between the two countries. And obviously she was an American spying for the British. And yeah, I guess just a bit more background about sort of spycraft at that time, what her innovations were, what her lasting impact was.
Yeah, it was interesting. I mean, obviously America came into the war much later than Britain, but it also came into this sort of form of intelligence, half intelligence, half special forces, because most spies don't go around blowing up bridges. They tend to just gather intelligence, where she was doing both, and that was quite unusual and something that, yes, she did pioneer, and something that the CIA, when I spent the day at Langley, said, for instance, I guess they wouldn't tell me about anything more recent, but there was something called Operation Jawbreaker, which was in Afghanistan before and after 9/11, when they were wanting to form local networks to support their own troops at some point, and they said that they looked at what Virginia did and replicated it in Afghanistan. So it is pretty amazing that what she was getting up to in the 1940s is still being used now. And I guess that some of the things that she did was looking in places for recruits that other people might not think of, finding a way to give them hope and a sense of loyalty, but also this discipline that you mustn't tell other people what you're doing. You can tell me because I'm your commander. I can tell one other person, so and so, so that you have these discrete cells of people, maybe 5 or 6. You know only those other people. You don't know any other cell, because once you know about, you might never ever want to give them away. But if you're caught and you're tortured, none of us knows how long we could hold out. If we could hold out for a minute, we just don't know. No one expected you to hold out for more than 48 hours. If someone was caught who knew a lot, everyone took that next 48 hours to get into hiding. But it was that kind of building up from nowhere, building up, giving people hope, giving people structure, giving them instructions too, that was really important. Constantly being on the move, only ever using code names, never ever using your own name, never giving away where you live, but always having a place that you can exchange messages. So one of the places that she exchanged messages was with in a laundry, where the owner of the laundry would put, I mean, it sounds a bit hello, this is all true, would put stockings in sort of neat piles close together if she had messages, and the neat piles would be further apart if she didn't. There was Jean-Michel Jarre, I don't know if any of you have heard of him, a musician. His mother was involved in Virginia's resistance too. She had an underwear shop, and she used to hide guns under piles of bras in the back room. I mean, all these people who you would never expect. I think the thing is that spies don't look like spies. They don't look like James Bond. They really don't. They look like all of us in this room. I think Virginia was really good at doing that and winning people's trust to the point that she needed it. I mean, one of her recruits was the local police chief. Well, that was a really smart move. She managed to get him to trust her so that he tipped her off when they were about to mount a raid on a place, or he would also try and let her know when the Gestapo were up to things. So those techniques, that kind of discipline, never going straight to a building. If I want to go and see someone in that cafe, I have a meeting with them, I don't just walk into the cafe. I go round the block first. I monitor it before I go in. I might spend a quarter of an hour doing that. That person only knows my code name. I only know their code name. We will never meet at that cafe again. Also, within the space of a few hours, she could make herself look completely different. She'd change her parting, put glasses on, a hat, put little rubber slithers in her cheeks, put gloves on to hide her hands, wear different sorts of clothes. So she could be Brigitte, Marie, Philomene and Virginia in the space of 3 or 4 hours. Always elusive, never going the same way. So all of these techniques are ones that she kind of had to make up on the hoof, as it were, and are now used by the CIA.
So we've talked quite a lot about what she did during the war, and but then she had this whole, sort of second act to her life at the CIA. But before we get to that, she did also amazingly, in the midst of all of this, all these different identities, the danger, find love during World War II. And that certainly is not, sort of cliche thrust of your book at all, but you do, I felt so attached to Virginia that I was I was so pleased. Could you tell us a little bit about
Well, it's
about
hard
that?
not to cheer, actually, because, after after she lost her leg, she had been lonely. She had been very much on her own. I mean, she felt kind of separated from other people, all qualities in a way that make for a good spy, but not necessarily a happy life. And then towards the end of the fighting in the Second World War, she'd been absolutely shouting again and again. She was in charge of all these Frenchmen. It was unruly. She was a foreigner. It was difficult. She always wanted backup from base. By this point, she's working for the Americans. It never came until the fighting in her part of France was pretty much over. And then 2 American officers were parachuted in to help her, ironically right at the end. Anyway, it was jolly good that they did, because one of them, this chap called Paul, who was, by the way, 6 inches shorter than her, 7 years younger than her, and obviously more junior than her, was one of those 2 who was parachuted in to help her. And he was French-American. He was sort of French by background. And he did everything she wanted to do, obeyed her orders, watched her back for her, but also made her laugh. I don't think there'd been much laughing for a wee while in her life, and he certainly lightened her life, and they stayed together for the rest of their life. And there's a sort of amazing thing that I found out from her niece, is how they commandeered a chateau at one point. They were looking for more fighting. I mean, they just liberated one bit of France, but that kind of wasn't enough for her. She wanted to get rid of Germans elsewhere, and they commandeered this chateau, and there was a lake on the chateau, and there was a boat on the lake, and things happened that night, according to the niece. And war often tested relationships to destruction, but amazingly, from that night to the day she died, they stayed together, even though her mother, if you remember, who wanted her to marry well, i.e. money, refused to acknowledge him. He was a chef by background and didn't have any money, didn't have much of an education either. So amazingly, despite the fact that Virginia wasn't scared of the Gestapo or the Vichy police or fighting Germans or the rest of it, she was a teeny bit scared of her mum, and she had to hide this relationship for about 20 years until she finally admitted, yeah, we're still together, and yeah, we're going to get married next week. But she left it until quite late in life to get married for that reason, because she was scared of her mum's reaction. So it just sort of, it's such a human side to Virginia. There was a sort of a soft side to her too.
Yeah, no, I love her relationship with her mother. So she was then, after the war, involved in the very early days of the CIA. Could you tell us a bit about what her role was and some of the challenges that she had at the CIA, despite this incredible wealth of knowledge she brought to them?
So she, at the end of the war, she was the only civilian woman of the whole war to be decorated with the Distinguished Service Cross, which is a very, very prestigious medal. In America, President Truman himself wanted to give it to her, but she said, no, thank you, Mr. President. I want to remain a secret agent, so I can't be doing with any publicity. So she just had it in this private ceremony. But she was a recognised, full-on, massive war hero who had done all this secret stuff and turned round the intelligence war. And she couldn't get a job. After the war, it was really difficult, and the CIA was set up, and it took her a long time even to join the CIA. And even when she did, that's when her real troubles began, because you see, she was seen as this sacred presence because of what she'd done, but that just produced a lot of resentment, because most of the men that she was with at the CIA, and there weren't many women, let's face it at this point, had done nothing like what she'd done in the war. I mean, they'd been sitting behind a desk, or they'd been too young, or they hadn't blown up bridges and things in the way that she had. And there was a lot of resentment, and I managed to get from the CIA her personnel files, where the way that they talk about her is absolutely horrifying. They belittle her and undermine her, say she's got no ingenuity, no resolve, no ideas. They even sort of question her stability and courage. When you think what she'd just been through, it is utterly absurd. But the story tells of someone being basically frozen out again and again and again. And there's this guy called E. Howard Hunt who was part of the Watergate thing, so basically a baddie. He went to prison for that, but he was actually someone who saw what was happening to Virginia and wrote about how appalling this was, that she was basically shut out of everything. And when she said, I don't think that's a very good idea, she was just branded as a sort of conservative with no ideas of her own. But when you think what the CIA was up to at that point, I mean, you know, great trance like the Bay of Pigs, I don't think, you know, they could have done with more people saying you need to plan this properly. But her great sense that being meticulous was essential in these operations kind of pushed to one side. So, I mean, really that's why the book is called A Woman of No Importance, because that is how she was very much treated before the war, when the State Department excluded her. After the war, when the CIA pretty much behaved the same, society was becoming much more reactionary and conservative again. But obviously during the war, she was this figure of exceptional importance, but that story's been lost.
I want to open it up to the audience shortly, but I just wanted to mention too that you know, unsurprisingly, the film rights were snapped up very quickly, and so if you could tell us a little bit about that, but also how do you think Virginia, you know, who sort of kept all of these secrets, you know, who, as you say, didn't want to accept this medal in front of anyone so she could keep being a spy, how do you think she would feel about her life now hitting the bestseller list and maybe being on the big screen? Do you think would she mind?
I don't know. I mean, I think instinctively she would worry about it. I have to admit, I mean, I've asked myself this question a lot. But I also think that she wanted things to be more meritocratic. And if she could push down some barriers, I mean, she was the only woman out in France, the SOE, for a whole year. She was the guinea pig, if you like. So it was only because she was so spectacularly successful that they ever sent more women into the field, and they never did the same sort of thing as she did. But Gina Haspel, who recently became the first female director of the CIA last year, when she accepted the job, she said that she was standing on the shoulders of heroines who'd gone before her, who had pushed down barriers. And I think it's pretty clear that Virginia would have been foremost amongst those. She was talking about women at the CIA and its predecessor OSS, where Virginia worked. So I think Virginia would be pleased ultimately that things are changing. I think she'd be pretty dismayed it's taken so long and that, you know, things are still having to change. So I like to think that she'd be pleased about that side of it. And yeah, I mean, as to the film, I mean, I guess her life is so epic and in a way so pictorial and full of action. I mean, it just never stops her life being exciting and extraordinary. And it, I mean, it's absolutely fantastic news. It's going to hopefully be made into a huge film.
Yeah. Can you, I know these things are always under wraps, but can you tell us where the film is in terms of...
The Paramount Studios are the studios, and Bad Robot, who make Star Wars movies, are producing it because the Star Wars kind of, you know, thing is basically winding up now. So they were looking for something new to get their teeth into. They're working on the script right now. I was in LA a couple of weeks ago, and we were talking about how on earth do we fit everything that she did into a screenplay. It's so difficult to leave things out because so much is exciting. So I'm no expert in films, but they seem to be working very hard on it right now, which is great.
Great,
yeah.
Brilliant. So yeah, I think let's open it up to the audience.
So I can start with a question. So I was curious about, so you mentioned that a big part of Virginia's work and her life in general was to be able to maintain multiple identities at the same time and to be able to switch between identities. So I was curious if you could elaborate a bit on how do you actually do that when you have a very big detail that gives away your true identity as a wooden leg?
Yeah. Yes, well, she, the limp was obviously an issue, so she deliberately took huge strides to try and disguise it. I mean, it got worse when she was tired. I guess these things always do. That was a problem. But the fact that she still managed to do this despite that is pretty indicative of how good she was. I guess, you know, I mean, President Roosevelt, who was the American president at the time, I mean, he was dependent on a wheelchair. You rarely were aware of that at the time because he found ways of disguising it. I suspect she did things like met people sitting down when she could, or tried not to walk along with them so much. But, word did get round, and there's one occasion which was written about by this guy who is walking along beside her, thinks that she has a wooden leg, but she's walking so fast and so briskly. He's saying, "Is it true that you have a wooden leg?" And later on that night, they're having dinner, and she takes it off and kind of does this against the table so that he can hear it's hollow, because it was so rudimentary, by the way. It's nothing like those high-tech things you see now. It was painted wood, flesh-coloured wood, with a metal toe and a metal heel, and leather straps around her waist. That was it. This was kind of Long John Silver type stuff, and yet somehow she managed to do this kind of thing. I mean, the secret of that will never probably totally get.
As an American in Paris, or as a foreigner in France, how did she manage to even get started and not be given away, for instance, by her accent?
Well, she did have an accent. I mean, her French was pretty good, but she did have quite a heavy American accent. She was very lucky, and this is one of the things that, was lucky for her to begin with. While America was not in the war, and they didn't join the war obviously until December 41, she could go in undercover as an American journalist, which is what she did. And initially, when she didn't have a radio operator and any other way of contacting London, she contacted her controllers, this is unbelievable, with coded messages in her articles in the New York Post. So the people in London would have to get hold of a copy of the newspaper and then scan it, all the different kind of code things to get her messages. They had no way of contacting her at all to begin with. But also being a journalist meant that she had cover for going around and being nosy and asking people questions and travelling around. Obviously, after America came into the war, that became more and more difficult. She stopped sending articles into the New York Post, or very few. She no longer said where she was in France. She would say if she did write an article somewhere in France, so she wouldn't give her whereabouts. But more and more and more, she went completely undercover. The accent was a problem. Sometimes she would get other people to talk on her behalf, say that, that she had problems speaking or something. There were all kinds of techniques that she used to get around that. But the initial thing was fine because she was, to all intents and purposes, an American.
As you said, she helped raise the resistance, establish the resistance in France. And one of the key things is to not get any collaborators or something inside. So did she have a special sense about sensing people who could give the institution away? Or?
That is such a good question. Do you know, having spoken to quite a few intelligence officers now about this, it does sound like one of the qualities you need as a spy undercover is a highly developed sixth sense. So some kind of feeling as to what people's motives or incentives are. That said, of course, anyone that she recruited could be a collaborator. And there were huge rewards. If you shop someone to the Gestapo, you could make a serious amount of money. There was a great incentive to do that. So obviously her sixth sense was very well developed. I mean, she was very good at listening at a door. She would never just walk into a room. She'd always listen first, if she was going to meet someone, just in case they were doing something that made them suspicious or, potentially, betray her in some way. She was ultimately betrayed by someone, which is the reason, the final catalyst for her having to escape at the end of 1942, a priest who was the most unbelievably wicked double agent who managed to infiltrate himself into her network and who was responsible for dozens, if not hundreds, of deaths, a chap by the name of Robert Alesh. And, it was brilliant being a priest, of course, because so many people instinctively thought, he must be a goodie. There he is, he's in a cassock. And he was giving sermons in his church, denouncing the Nazis and the Third Reich. And then the young guys in his congregation would come up and talk to him about what they'd done for the resistance, and the next day they'd all be rounded up because he would have sold them. He took much more care over how he was bringing in the net closer and closer and closer to Virginia. Her sixth sense did work. She by this point she could contact London through a radio. She said, "I can't believe he's a phony, but ... So obviously there was this seed of doubt in her mind. But A, he was a priest that the others trusted, and B, he kept turning up with incredible intelligence that seemed absolutely brilliant. Unfortunately, it had all been doctored by the Germans. It looked great, it was useless. So on this occasion, she just let her armour down. Maybe she was so tired she couldn't quite deal with it anymore. But as a result of his work, she got away over the Pyrenees. But the brothel Madame Germaine Garin, for instance, he caught her. She was sent to Ravensbrück, the appalling women's concentration camp where they injected you with gangrene, where so many died. She survived only just. She was never the same again. And her other chief lieutenant, who was the VD doctor who worked with the brothel, was sent to Buchenwald, and he just survived. Many others didn't, though. So that was the time she got it wrong. I think after that, she was even more careful, if that's possible. Yeah.
Hi there, thank you. It's fascinating. Did you find the French authorities were helpful with any information? Did they record much?
Not unhelpful, but this is this is quite a tricky subject in France. Looking at what happened in the war, there were many heroes, but there were also many collaborators. And who's not to say that wouldn't have been the same here before we get sort of superior about it? I don't suppose it would have been any different here if we'd been occupied, but it is still something that's quite difficult to deal with. So it isn't always easy to get the files that you want. They don't obstruct you, but they don't make it easy. On the other hand, there was this archive that I found in Lyon, where there's a resistance museum, which is an amazing place, and upstairs there's a library and this particular archive, which was all about Virginia, and they couldn't have been more helpful because no one else had ever looked at it. So when I rocked up and said, I'd like to spend a week here, they're very religious about their lunch hours in France, I'm sure you know. Normally they would close the office down, everyone would get chucked out. But I only had a week, and the guy said, no, don't worry, you can work through your lunch hour. Now that was a big concession, and I'm very grateful to this day. So I think they were really pleased because here was a Frenchman who'd done the right thing, and that was great. So I realise that there are sensitivities here, but I'd also like to say that, some of those French people who fought with her were just incredible heroes, and I tell their story too. There was this young guy called Marcel Letcher in his 30s who was executed by the Germans, but did so much with her. She called him her nephew. He was only a few years younger than her. He called her his auntie. But, that was an international bond that we can probably never imagine. And the guys that she fought with in the Haute-Loire liberated the department with all these letters they wrote to each other after the war. They said it in different ways, but the feeling was always the same. The sentiment was always the same, and it really touched me, which was it had been worth being born just for that moment with Virginia Hall, those 2 months when they were all on the same side, all different backgrounds, different nationalities, but all with the same cause, which was kind of getting rid of the Nazis, freedom for France, and peace again. And I think that international message is so sort of strong that, was something that came out so powerfully that I think ultimately it's good for France, and it's good for Britain, it's good for America, and it's kind of good for all of us.
And I'm interested in how you got the information from the CIA. Like how did you access people there and the files and stuff? Thank you.
Well, just an amazing piece of luck. I do think luck comes into these things. When I started researching here, I was at the National Archives in Kew, and I was the second day, and someone tapped me on the shoulder. I thought I must have done something wrong. He said he wanted to speak to me outside, and it turned out to be a retired MI6 officer. They speak in riddles, but anyway, that's basically what he was. And he was really helpful, showing me documents, getting stuff declassified over here. And then he had a friend in America who knew someone in the who was recently retired from the CIA, who also helped me get some stuff declassified, made some connections with me at the CIA. So I applied to go there for a day so I could speak to them, see these documents. It took some time. They eventually said yes. Even when you get to the CIA, there's yet more security. And they told me that I'd gone through 9 levels of security just to be allowed to go to Langley, and one of which there'd been a non-concur, which is the phrase they use. And I said, well, what's that? And they said, well, it's because you're a foreign national. So I said, well, how come I'm here then? And they said, someone high up said, don't worry, she can come. I said, well, who? I can't tell you. Why? Don't know. But anyway, so I've got a friend at the CIA who knew. And so I was allowed to go see these documents, look at their own internal documents about her now, in which they accept we did not use her talents well. You bet you didn't. And also all those annual appraisals and the other stuff about her. So I think maybe the CIA finally wanted her story to come out. They are trying, I think, to change things. She is now a poster girl, in a sense, for inclusivity at the CIA. They have named a new training building after her, hurrah. And maybe it was just the right time that people were prepared to have this out in the open. Because although it seemed like I was never going to be able to open the door, ultimately it opened enough so I could sort of get a pretty good view.
If you Google Virginia Hall, one of the top results is her, like, the CIA employing people with disabilities page.
Yeah.
It's hope there's more current stuff on there too. Yeah. But yeah, they do definitely seem, as you say, she's a kind of poster girl for that now. So.
She has become that now. Yeah.
I also just wanted to know if you found information at the CIA from before she came, before she was a spy with them, from the time where she was a spy for the British.
When she went to what? Sorry.
So did you find information at the CIA for the time during the war, or was it only after the time she was? The
CIA was only formed after the war.
Oh, okay.
During the war. There was a sort of forerunner of the CIA called the OSS, which she went to work for after. See, when she escaped over the Pyrenees, the Gestapo knew all about her. They had photographs of her. They had sent this signal out across the whole of France saying, we must find and destroy her. She said, so when she got back to London, amazingly, right, I want to go back now. Well, the Brits said, there's no way we're going to send you back. Every single Gestapo officer in France has your photograph. They all have this command to find and destroy you. We're not sending you back. Are you joking? So that's when she went and worked for the Americans, who didn't know quite so much what had been going on, hadn't had quite the same sort of grounding in the barbarity of the war in France, were prepared to send her back, but as a milkmaid with the wrinkles and things. The OSS was disbanded at the end of the war, but then re-emerged basically as the CIA a few years later. So that's how it happened. And there were very, very, very few women, if any others, who at the OSS who did what Virginia did. It was still, they did other things, code breaking and things, but not so much behind enemy lines as Virginia. Yeah, so she changed stuff.
Sorry if you already said, did you meet her niece?
Yes, I did.
And if so, so the physicality of meeting someone that was a relation, did a lot of this really come to life for you? Did it make a difference?
Oh, yes. Absolutely. So we'd had several conversations on the phone, and then I went and spent some time with her in Baltimore. And yes, because, suddenly it all makes sense. When you're writing a biography, initially you think, I can't quite get this person. And you need to, I think it must be a little bit like method acting, that you need to have that kind of understanding. And I never completed it, I felt, until I met Lorna and spent some time with her. And she opened the family photo album. So some of the pictures you'll see in the book are from her photo album, and they're great. And she called her Aunt Dindy. It was the family nickname. So sort of talking about Dindy and what Paul was like, and Paul made her laugh. And just hearing all of that having that sort of first-hand connection with her, it's like the sort of light bulb comes on, and it gives you confidence as a writer. Yeah, I know my subject now. I've seen all those papers, I've read all those accounts, I've read the letters, I've dug here and I've dug there, but finally I have that personal account, and that sort of makes it kind of whole. And it was a great moment. She's a fantastic woman in her own right. You know, as I say, 89, she drove to the station to pick me up in Baltimore, went back to her house, insisted on making me lunch, went for a walk around the garden. She's great. I mean, absolutely great. And she sent me the most touching email the other day saying that you've got her, you've absolutely got her, I'm so thrilled. And I think that's sort of kind of getting emotional about it now. That was the best moment of any of this when she did that, I have to say. Yeah.
All right, thanks a lot. It's
Thank
been
you.
really exciting.